I think we have several that are joining us. I want to take the time to welcome everybody this evening for coming to the National Association of Black Counselors response to the Buffalo massacre. We want to thank you for just taking the time out of your busy schedule to have this important discussion with us and take the time as mental health professionals to come up with some solutions, talk about our feelings as well, and possibly find ways forward together. We wanted to do this because we have found in doing some research that there have been a proliferation of hate crimes within the last 2 years within the country. Specifically starting in 2020, the FBI reported a surge in hate crimes targeting African Americans. In 2020, about 64.9% of the 8,052 incidents were based on race, ethnicity, or ancestry bias within that year. However, 64.9% of those cases were for African Americans, making us the most targeted racial group in America. It was a little bit over 2,000 incidents, and those are reported incidents of hate crimes against us that were reported. And again, these are reported to the FBI from over 15,000 law enforcement agencies across the country, and they're voluntarily reported. So between what is not reported by victims and what is not reported by law enforcement agencies, the picture must be maybe a little bit darker than that in terms of the numbers of hate crimes. But they have seen a proliferation. There's been a 100% increase in the amount of hate crime groups in America. And the proliferation we saw increase exponentially during Trump's tenure in office. So tonight we have a panel of esteemed people with us that are going to help discuss this matter and hopefully help us ferret out some solutions and some suggestions for a brighter hope for us. The first panelist I'd like to introduce is Dr. David J. Ford Jr. He is originally from North Carolina and is a licensed board counselor in North Carolina, Virginia, and New Jersey. He is a board certified counselor and an approved clinical supervisor. He is currently a professor of counseling and education at Mammoth University in New Jersey. And we are pleased to have him with us tonight. I would like to also introduce Dr. Atasha Christian, who is a native of New Kent County in Virginia. She is currently, she received her MA in professional counseling from South University and her doctorate from Argosy in 2017. She's got 15 years of experience in working with children and adolescents. One of her specialties is trauma, and she does largely community-based work, especially within marginalized communities. So we're pleased to have her as well. We also want to welcome Reverend Alvin Herring, who is the executive director of Faith in Action. It's the largest grassroots faith-based organizing network in the United States. He's an ordained minister and also has a background in mental health. So we are thankful that he has joined us this evening as well. And last but not least, we have, we have Dr. Malik Rahim, who is the president of the National Association of Black Counselors and is currently an assistant clinical rehabilitation counseling department professor at Wilberforce University. He's a counselor educator, attempts to ensure his students are multiculturally competent counselors and social justice advocates. So Dr. Rahim is going to be bringing a wealth of knowledge to us. And last but not least, our vice president at National Association of Black Counselors, Dr. M. Nicholson Battle Jr., who is a counselor, who is a licensed counselor in Virginia, Maryland, and the District of Columbia. He holds a doctorate in counseling psychology from Argosy and has a private practice that works in community mental health as well in the Maryland, I believe it's Baltimore area. So thank you to all of our esteemed panelists. We're going to begin with some questions. And then once we begin with some questions in between, Dr. Faye Barner, who is the other executive director here at the National Association of Black Counselors, is going to be manning the chat while I moderate. And we will be asking participants to put their questions in the chat. And if we have time, we'll even open up the floor for them to ask questions to our panelists and become part of the discussion as well. So let's begin. Dr. Rahim, you're the lucky one. I'm going to begin with you. So the first question we want to pose to the panel is, and I'm posing the question specifically to Dr. Rahim, and you guys can chime in. How should community leaders / counselors be responding to this massacre and crisis in Buffalo?
Thank you for having me. Let's see. That's a difficult question. I'm kind of disappointed I got the most difficult question of it is. That's kind of not fair.
It's not
Um,
fair.
no,
Okay.
not fair. Not fair at all. Um, One of the things I think that counselors and leaders need to be um, handling is when dealing with any traumatic when dealing with any traumatic incident that's happening, especially when it's anti-black, is making sure that you do a community approach, have many healing circles, um, be very empathetic with what's happening in the community prior to and what is continually happening in the community. Um, be ready for some forms of resistance, because trauma takes on different forms, and it manifests itself to look different ways. So I think the obvious answer is to go in there and to work with the community to try to heal the community, but also be prepared to deal with your secondary trauma that you might experience, because a lot of the counselors and leaders might not be directly related to the community, but they are part to a lesser extent of the community, because I like to think of the African diaspora as a family. Sometimes we might not get along with our cousins or aunties or uncles, but they're still family. So I like to look at it to where it's like what happens to one of us happens to all of us. So as counselors and leaders, we got to be ready to heal, but we also got to be ready to heal ourselves. But looking at the community aspect of it, we have to get into the trenches, work hard, be ready for some resistance, be ready for some backlash, and make sure that you understand necessarily that your perspective is not the only perspective, and just 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 prepare yourself for some gut wrenching trauma work, because when you're dealing with situations like this, it's such a shock, and when the shock happens like this, you're dealing with um, a community, not just those 10 families, but the whole community is hurting, is crying. And I'm looking forward to hearing, from the Reverend about the boots that are on the ground now in Buffalo. But the thing is that as community activists, as counselors, it's very very important that we go out there and work within the community, heal the community, do healing circles, individual counseling, um, and just trauma work is very very difficult, because there's 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 chances of transference, and you got to be aware of that transference. Chances of counter transference, you got to be aware of that counter transference. So there's a lot of things that as counselors we got to do when we're healing the community, but also making sure that we, remain true to healing ourselves.
Anybody else have a response?
I would add to that too. That was a really good response, Dr. Rahim, for that to be the hardest question. You did a good job, my brother. I'll say another thing is we can't be afraid of backing up and saying no to folks that want us to relive our trauma for their own gain. White folks have this tendency to want to put us out front and talk about these things, knowing good and damned well they already know about it. And then they want us to do this work for free, not knowing the emotional labor that we're experiencing. So I'm not going to let somebody pimp my pain. And like Dr. Rahim said, we're hurting too. We're hurting vicariously, so you can't compare your pain to others. But then don't come have me to speak on something in an all-white environment and relive my pain, and then you leave it with some sense of that's their stuff. I have nothing to do with that. I'm not the one to be a part of some white person's minstrel show and then not throw some dollar signs at me in the process. So they may be those well-meaning whites, they're the worst ones, but we have to be the ones to say, you know what, go do your own work and then come talk to me, because I'm sick of these white allies. I say my allyship is ally shit. That's what I say, and so I'm sick of that too, and I'm sick of these blind ass Black folks that don't see the pain either. So those of us that are in the trenches doing the work and then being vicariously traumatized and also experiencing the compassion fatigue, sometimes we have to back up and say no.
Can I follow up with Dr. Ford? It's gonna be hard to follow up with Dr. Ford. I always said Dr. Ford bring the fire and brimstone. Also letting the community know that there's a cycle of grieving, and it's okay not to be so ready and quick to say I forgive. Right? If you truly in your heart forgive, that's fine. I'm not going to tell anybody they shouldn't forgive. But if you truly in your heart forgive, but I don't want anyone feeling pressured that they have to say I forgive. Sometimes in order to get over your pain, you got to acknowledge that pain, right? And you got to work through that cycle of grief, right? Because even if you weren't directly impacted by 1 to 10 people that were murdered, right? You might have known them. You might have, it's probably a really small community. You might have known them. You might have seen them before. You might